Bank collapse and bank runs is coming to America. Prepare now. The US economy is going through an unprecedented meltdown, and the impact of the global health problem is astonishing. This is the biggest economic crisis since the Great Depression. Experts are warning that things might get worse in the near future. Banks and other over-leveraged financial institutions are finding themselves in big problems. It might be a matter of time before we see a cascade of bank failures. We are already in a severe financial meltdown that might end up being greater than the 1930s depression. The markets are plummeting at a rate never seen before, and thousands of businesses are already closed, or at least they have suspended their operations. Even if the Federal Reserve has made efforts by pumping trillions of dollars into the economy, everything is still a mess, and it's clear that the economy will not recover very soon. Many sectors will be affected, and the banking industry will end up being the hardest hit. The stock market has been in a freefall. In the last 2 months, the markets have crashed by more than 30%. Wealth worth trillions of dollars has been lost. This has happened within a very short period of time, and if this trend continues, we will find ourselves in the middle of a depression. The financial markets are very unstable at the moment. This is affecting the banking system too. The Fed has guaranteed unlimited liquidity in the markets, but this will not help the economy. Restoring the economy is the only solution at the moment because pumping more cash to the markets will only amplify the debt levels in the economy. This strategy will only work for a short period of time, and the economy will still suffer in the long run. The government should focus on improving the real economy and not endlessly pump in cash into the stock markets. Actually, only a small percentage of Americans own stocks. This means that only the big banks and other financial institutions are benefiting from this. Banks do not create a lot of value. All they do really is steal from the economy. Some of the big banks, like the Deutsche Bank, are already struggling financially. The repo market is also very unstable. This is becoming a challenge to most banks. This has forced the Federal Reserve to step in to bring back the sanity in the repo market, which has been a smoking gun. The Fed has announced they'll be providing up to $500 billion in liquidity. Some of the banks are at the verge of a collapse, and the collapse of one bank will definitely affect other banks. In reality, banks are interconnected, and the collapse of one bank can easily trigger a banking crisis. At the moment, most banks are over-leveraged and they are loaded with debt. The debt in the banking sector is at an all-time high. This is very dangerous to the financial system and the economy at large. The debt bubble in the banking sector has been ignored for many years, and it's now about to burst. Many banks will have to go bankrupt, and with the current economic fallout, it might be next to impossible for the Federal Reserve to bail out banks this time. Just a few days ago, the Labor Department reported over 3.3 million jobless claims because of the recent disruption in business activities. Businesses are struggling to remain afloat, and as businesses go through extremely difficult financial times, analysts are predicting that it will be almost impossible for some banks to keep up with the financial demands. Some small banks in the US are already facing headwinds to remain in business without being acquired. The biggest banking crisis of all time might be ahead of us. At the moment, we have record levels of unemployment in the United States. This means that millions of Americans have already lost their incomes. If they have any loans, it'll be almost impossible for them to pay, because if this crisis continues for months, it'll be difficult even to buy food in the United States. This will definitely result to a cascade of defaults, and the American banking sector will register the biggest losses in history. Some of the banks that have issued excess loans might not make it past this crisis. It's still unclear how the $2 trillion aid package will contain this economic fallout. The United States economy has been suffering for several months, and the health problem is becoming complicated every day. At the moment, there's no light at the end of the tunnel. Economists are predicting that the economy will suffer more losses. The 2008 global financial crisis forced some banks to shut down. Records show that 489 financial institutions were closed. With the current crisis, many analysts are pointing out that the levels of capital in various banks will drop significantly. At the moment, the economy is suffering as a result of public health problems. This is very different from the 2008 economic meltdown, where the economy suffered because of the total collapse of the housing market. In this cycle of banking crisis, the amount of loan defaults the banks will have to suffer is not clear at the moment, because it will take 2 to 3 months for loan delinquencies to turn into charge-offs, which become losses for the banks. Analysts are stating that it will be impossible for the banks to avoid big losses in this crisis. Companies in airlines, hotel businesses, they're most hit by this economic meltdown. These two big industries will experience a lot of financial difficulties, and banks that are overexposed in these industries will suffer the most. It is 1 week after the Federal Reserve expanded its monetary program to stimulate the economy. In the words of the legendary investor Paul Tudor Jones, the Fed has launched a nuclear bomb to the capital markets. They've monetized everything. Some obvious signs are emerging indicating that these spreads are tightening very fast. This move by the Federal Reserve will be welcomed by many companies that are in short-term need for funding. However, this funding by the Fed is not enough to unfreeze the whole commercial paper market. This is the reason why most companies are still drawing revolvers. Based on the report produced by JP Morgan, the amount of borrowing by American companies is more likely to be above 80%. This represents only the amounts disclosed by large companies. We might have a lot of undisclosed borrowing from small and medium-sized companies. This means that companies are demanding more funding from the banks. This amount has risen to a record high of $208 billion. This means that billions are being drained from the banks every day. This means that the banks are going through financial constraints, and as a result, we have increased tensions in the interbank funding market. The demand for money has increased sharply because of this financial crisis. This is stretching the banks beyond their limits. Very soon they might collapse. Banks are going through a liquidity crisis, which might end up causing bank runs. Individual depositors are pulling out their money at historic rates, and at the same time, big corporations are also drawing down at levels never seen before. Banks are struggling to keep up with money demand. Banks are beginning to fear because this might not end anytime soon. Banks are going through unprecedented liquidity challenges, and at the same time, they're fearing that some of the companies might go bankrupt in a few months if this economic meltdown continues. Because of this, some of the biggest American banks have been quietly discouraging Americans from borrowing, because banks don't want to tap into existing thin credit lines amid this record drawdown on corporate lending systems. The banking system is being hit by a huge wave of withdrawals and revolvers from big corporations. This is jeopardizing the limited liquidity in the banks. The profit margins of most banks will decline, while some of the banks will be overstretched and they will fall short of liquidity. If this demand continues for the next 2 months, we will see a lot of bank runs, and this will trigger the biggest banking crisis in history. The United States economy is going through a historic level of economic meltdown. The banking industry is also troubled. It might be a matter of time before the biggest bubble in the banking industry bursts. We're going through a big economic crisis. At the same time, the banking crisis of the decade is ahead of us. We're about to see huge bank runs and bank failures in the near future unless the whole system is fixed. Our financial system is already broken. It's reached a point where Americans cannot trust the system anymore. The Trump administration should focus on solving the health problem, because this is the only way the economy can open up. It's very clear that the status of the U.S. economy and the banking sector is getting worse every day. In America, citizens are suffering badly in the process. Experts are already warning that the worst is about to come, and the best thing you can do is prepare for the worst.